The air in the high country was a blade, honed sharp by granite and pine, and Anya Sharma breathed it in like a long-denied sacrament. It scoured the dust of Kandahar from her lungs, a phantom grit that had lingered for 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days. Here, the only explosions were the shatter of sunlight through the dense canopy of hemlock and fir, the only ambushes the sudden, heart-stopping flight of a grouse from the underbrush. She had bought the silence for 50 cents. 2 quarters slid across the dusty counter of the county clerk's office, a transaction so absurd it felt like a dream. In return, she'd received a folded, brittle deed to a parcel of land so remote and undesirable it had been forfeited for back taxes 3 decades prior. Lot 73, Whisperwind Ridge. It came with a cabin, the clerk had added with a smirk, and a ghost. Anya had just nodded. She'd come to the mountains seeking ghosts, but only her own. She had hoped they might quiet themselves in the vast emptiness of the Alleghenies. Her companion, a broad-shouldered German shepherd the color of storm clouds and ash, sat beside her on the rotted porch steps. His name was Ghost. The irony was not lost on her. He wasn't named for the supernatural, but for his ability to move through the broken terrain of a war zone with an unnerving silence, a phantom of lethal grace. His official designation had been Tactical K-9 Ghost, serial number G-473. To Anya, he was the anchor that kept her from drifting away on the tide of memory. His flank pressed against her thigh, a solid, living warmth that was more real than the splintered wood beneath her or the hazy blue peaks that serrated the horizon. A low rumble started in his chest, a vibration more felt than heard. It wasn't a growl of aggression, but of deep, instinctual unease. His ears, perfectly triangulated, swiveled to lock onto the cabin's dark, gaping doorway behind them. Anya ran a hand down his back, the coarse guard hairs familiar under her palm. "Easy, boy," she murmured, her voice rough from disuse. "It's just wood and nails." Old memories, but Ghost's unease was a language she had learned to trust more than spoken orders. In the field, his senses were an extension of her own, a finely tuned instrument that could detect the subtle displacement of Earth over a pressure plate, the faint chemical signature of C4, the whisper of a human heartbeat where there should have been none. He was not reacting to the cabin's decay, to the scent of rot and mouse leavings and time. His focus was too specific, too intent. It was the look he got just before he'd sit, a rigid, unblinking posture that signaled the presence of a threat buried from sight. He was signaling now, not sitting, but his entire body had gone taut, a loaded spring. The local legend, the one the smirking clerk had alluded to, was that of Silas Kane, a prospector who'd built the cabin with his own hands and had been murdered for a non-existent stash of gold, his spirit forever bound to the place, forever guarding his worthless claim. The stories kept people away, which had been the property's primary appeal. Anya didn't believe in vengeful spirits, but she believed in the palpable weight of a place, the residue of past violences. Perhaps that's what Ghost felt. But his training was for the tangible, the chemical, the physical. Anya stood, her knees protesting with the ache of old injuries. She moved with the economy of motion drilled into her by years of service, a quiet fluidity that belied the pain. She followed Ghost's gaze into the single room of the cabin. Dust motes danced like frantic sprites in the shafts of late afternoon light piercing the grimy windows. A stone hearth, black with the soot of 1,000 fires, dominated one wall. A rusted bed frame lay tilted in a corner. The floor was rough-hewn planks, some of them warped and broken. Ghost patted inside, his claws making soft clicking sounds on the wood. He ignored the corners, the hearth, the signs of animal infestation. He went directly to the center of the room, lowered his great head, and sniffed at a specific seam between 2 wide planks. The low rumble returned, a resonant thrum that vibrated up through the floor. Anya knelt beside him, her hand resting on his neck to calm him, though she knew it was for her own benefit. She put her nose to the floorboards. Nothing, just the smell of damp earth and decay. "What is it, buddy?" she whispered. He whined, a high, anxious sound that was utterly out of character, and pawed at the seam. It was a clear, unmistakable signal. Dig. He was telling her to dig. The first rule of explosive ordnance disposal was to trust your instruments. Ghost had been her primary instrument for 4 years. His nose had saved their unit more times than she could count. Her mind, conditioned by a decade of threat assessment, began to cycle through possibilities. A buried weapon cache? Unlikely, but possible. The remains of the apocryphal Silas Kane? Maybe. But Ghost wasn't a cadaver dog. His alerts were for specific compounds, for things that were manufactured, things that were dangerous. A flicker of her past, sharp and unwelcome, surfaced. The suffocating heat, the pressure of the bomb's suit, the sweat stinging her eyes as she stared at a tangle of wires connected to an old artillery shell. Ghost had found that one, hidden under the floor of a goat herder's hut. He had whined, just like this. The muscle in her jaw tightened. She had come here to escape that life, to silence the part of her brain that saw every unattended bag, every disturbed patch of earth, as a potential threat. Yet here, in the one place she had chosen for its profound and utter lack of consequence, her oldest instinct, her partnership with this magnificent animal, was telling her that something was wrong. Something was buried. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in violent hues of orange and purple, the colors of a fresh bruise. The temperature began to drop. She needed to get a fire going, secure the broken window, make the place defensible for the night. But she couldn't. Ghost sat, refusing to move from the spot, his silver-gray eyes fixed on her, waiting. He had given her the warning. Now it was her turn to act. This was the first entry in a journal she wasn't sure she'd ever let anyone read, a chronicle of a different kind of war. If you're following this journey, know that it began not with a bang, but with a dog's quiet insistence, a promise of secrets buried under the floor of a haunted cabin bought for the price of a ghost story. The first week was a ritual of reclamation. Anya worked from dawn until the last light bled from the sky, her movements a steady, rhythmic assault on decades of neglect. She replaced the broken window pane with a sheet of thick plexiglass she'd hauled up the mountain, patched the leaking roof with tar and scavenged tin, and cleared the hearth of a massive bird's nest, her hands raw and scraped by the end of each day. The physical labor was a balm, a way to exhaust her body so her mind had no energy left to wander down the dark, familiar pathways of memory. At night, the fire in the hearth pushed back the oppressive, breathing darkness of the forest, and the silence was no longer empty, but filled with the companionable crackle of burning oak and Ghost's soft, sleeping sighs. She tried to ignore the spot in the center of the room. She tried to convince herself that Ghost had smelled an animal's den, a nest of raccoons, or a hibernating bear, long dead and gone. She covered the floorboards with a threadbare rug she'd found in the back of her truck. Out of sight, out of mind. But Ghost would not let it be. He would lie on the rug, directly over the spot, his body a silent accusation. He wouldn't settle, his head always up, ears twitching at every groan of the old cabin. He ate his meals there. He slept there. He was a sentinel posted at a gate only he could perceive. His insistence was a quiet friction against her desperate need for peace. It was a reminder of a world where things were hidden, where surfaces were deceptive, where the ground beneath your feet could betray you. The world she had explicitly tried to leave behind. On the 8th day, a cold front swept down from the north, bringing with it a low, bruised sky and a wind that moaned through the pines like a choir of mourners. The temperature plummeted. It was a day for staying inside, for feeding the fire, for reading one of the worn paperbacks she'd brought with her. But the cabin felt small, confining. Ghost's silent vigil had turned the space into a waiting room. The air was thick with unspoken tension. Anya found herself pacing, her boots thudding on the uneven planks, a caged feeling constricting her chest. She stopped over the rug, looking down at the dog. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" Ghost lifted his head, his gaze steady, intelligent. He seemed to understand not just her words, but the fraying edge of her resolve. He nudged her hand with his wet nose, a gesture of encouragement, of partnership. It was the same way he'd nudge her before a mission, a silent, "I'm with you." A wave of weary resignation washed over her. "Fine," she sighed, the word a puff of white in the chilly air. "Fine. You win." She dragged the rug aside, exposing the dark, stained planks. The wood was old-growth oak, thick and hard as iron. She didn't have a crowbar, but she had a small hatchet and the tire iron from her truck. She knelt, wedging the flattened end of the tire iron into the seam Ghost had first indicated. The wood groaned in protest. She put her weight into it, her shoulders screaming from an old shrapnel wound, the tendons grinding. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cold. The first nail, long and rusted, shrieked as it pulled free. Then another, then a third. With a final, splintering crack, a section of the board lifted. The air that rose from the crawl space below was not the simple, earthy smell she expected. It was cold, sterile, with a faint, sharp chemical tang, like ozone after a lightning strike or the clean, metallic scent of a sterile laboratory. It was a smell that did not belong here, in this rustic, decaying cabin. It was the smell of something artificial, something hidden. Ghost whined again, a low, guttural sound of confirmation, and backed away, giving her space to work. His part was done. He had found it. Now it was her job to render it safe. Her heart began to beat a little faster, the familiar, controlled thrum of adrenaline entering her system. Her senses sharpened. The world narrowed to the dark opening at her feet. She fetched her headlamp, strapping it on and clicking it to life. The beam cut a clean, white cone into the darkness below. The crawl space was shallow, no more than 3 feet deep, the ground a dark, sandy loam. But directly beneath the opening, something was buried. She could see the edge of it, a dark, straight line that was too perfect, too precise for a rock or a root. It was the corner of something man-made. She spent the next hour carefully prying up the surrounding floorboards, her movements economical and precise, creating a workspace. The task was methodical, calming. It was a procedure, and she was good at procedures. Once she had a wide enough opening, she lowered herself into the crawl space, the damp cold seeping through the knees of her jeans. The object was a box, or a footlocker. It was made of dark gray metal, possibly aluminum or a composite alloy. It was about 3 feet long, 2 feet wide, and maybe 2 feet deep. There were no visible locks, but the lid was sealed tight, the seam fused with some kind of heavy-duty epoxy. It was military grade, or something very close to it. She recognized the design philosophy: durable, weatherproof, tamper-resistant. She ran her gloved hand over the surface. It was cold to the touch. There were no markings, no stencils, no serial numbers. It was anonymous. Her training screamed at her. An unmarked, sealed container buried under a floor. Her mind flashed through a dozen IED designs, victim-operated, command-detonated, timed. She forced the thoughts down. This felt different. It was old. There was a thick layer of dust and grime on it, but no signs of recent disturbance. This had been here for a long, long time. Still, she was careful. She examined the seams, looking for tripwires, for pressure switches, for any sign of an initiation system. Nothing. It was just a box. A heavy, sealed, mysterious box that a highly trained dog had alerted her to. She sat back on her heels in the dark, dusty space, the beam of her headlamp illuminating the strange object. The wind howled outside, rattling the plexiglass in the window frame. The ghost of Silas Kane felt like a child's tale now, a flimsy curtain pulled over something far more real and potentially far more dangerous. Ghost hadn't smelled a spirit. He had smelled the faint, persistent off-gassing of whatever was sealed inside this container. Chemicals leaching into the soil molecule by molecule over years, a scent too subtle for a human nose, but a blaring alarm for his. Anya looked up through the hole in the floor. Ghost was lying at the edge, his head on his paws, watching her, his presence a calm, reassuring weight. He trusted her to handle it. And she, in turn, had to trust his initial warning. This box was the reason the cabin was haunted. This was the secret the mountain was keeping. And she had just dug it up. The process of opening the container was an exercise in extreme caution, a slow, deliberate dance with the unknown. Anya treated it as she would an unexploded ordnance, a sleeping dragon that could wake at the slightest misstep. She first cleared the area, moving her pack, her tools, and her meager supplies to the far side of the cabin. She instructed Ghost to wait on the porch, a command he obeyed with a reluctant whine, his eyes never leaving her as he settled by the door. She then used a small brush to meticulously clean every inch of the container's surface, searching for hidden switches or engraved warnings. The metal was smooth, non-ferrous, and remarkably free of corrosion despite the dampness of the crawl space. It wasn't a standard military footlocker. It was something custom, something specialized. The seal was the main problem. The epoxy was as hard as stone. She considered using the hatchet to break it, but the risk of a spark or a concussive shock was too great. Instead, she chose a more patient method. Using a small, sharp file from her multi-tool, she began to slowly, painstakingly abrade the epoxy along one edge of the lid. The work was grueling. Sawdust-fine particles of gray resin dusted her gloves and jeans. Hours passed. The sun climbed high in the sky, its light streaming through the dirty windows, illuminating the still, focused tableau of the woman and the box. Her focus was absolute. The world outside the cabin ceased to exist. There was only the scrape of metal on resin, the steady rhythm of her breathing, the burn in her shoulders. She was back in the zone, a place of pure, unadulterated concentration where fear was a distant hum and the only thing that mattered was the delicate, life-or-death puzzle in front of her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she created a small breach in the seal. There was no hiss of escaping gas, no sudden change in pressure. A good sign. She switched from the file to the pry bar, using it now not as a hammer but as a scalpel, gently working the tip into the gap she had created. With excruciating slowness, she began to lever the lid up, millimeter by millimeter, listening for any click, any whir, any sound that didn't belong. The lid finally gave way with a low groan of protest, the last of the epoxy seal cracking like old ice. Anya held her breath, ready to drop and roll away at the slightest hint of danger. Nothing. She waited a full minute, her body coiled like a snake, before she allowed herself to look inside. The contents were not what she expected. There were no weapons, no explosives, no stacks of cash. The interior of the container was lined with thick, yellowed foam, and nestled within carefully cut compartments were dozens of leather-bound journals, stacks of paper held together by rusted binder clips, and several clear, plastic cases containing what looked like glass slides and small, cork-stoppered vials of murky water. A wave of anticlimax washed over her, so potent it almost made her dizzy. This was it. This was the great secret? A box of old papers? She carefully lifted out one of the journals. The leather was cracked and dry. The cover was unmarked. She opened it. The pages were filled with a small, precise, almost microscopic script, interspersed with complex geological diagrams and chemical formulas. The ink was faded but still legible. The first entry was dated over 30 years ago. She picked up a stack of loose papers. They were technical reports, water sample analyses from a lab she'd never heard of, filled with tables of data and columns of figures. She didn't understand most of it, but she recognized the symbols for lead, mercury, arsenic. The numbers next to them were followed by asterisks and notes handwritten in the margins. Anomalous readings. Levels exceed EPA maximums by 100x. Source must be upslope. A cold dread, far more chilling than the fear of an explosion, began to creep up her spine. This wasn't a treasure chest. It was a tombstone. It was the life's work of a man who had discovered something terrible and had taken great pains to preserve his findings. She found a smaller, separate journal tucked into a side pocket of the lid. This one was different. The writing was less technical, more personal. A name was written on the inside cover, Dr. Alistair Finch, Ph.D., Environmental Geology. The ghost finally had a name, and he wasn't a prospector. He was a scientist. Anya sat on the floor of the cabin, the contents of the box spread out around her, and began to read. Alistair Finch's story unfolded in the quiet, dusty room. He had been a university professor who, like her, had sought solace in these mountains. He'd bought the cabin as a research outpost, a base from which to study the unique geology of the region. But his research had led him down a dark path. He started noticing anomalies in the local ecosystem, mutated frogs in the streams, trees dying from the inside out, a strange, metallic taste to the spring water. His journals detailed his methodical investigation. He took samples, charted the water table, mapped the subterranean rock formations. His initial hypothesis was a natural deposit of heavy metals being leached into the groundwater. But the data didn't fit. The contaminants were too varied, too concentrated, and their appearance was too recent. The truth he uncovered was far more sinister. A corporation, Geo-Core Mineral Extraction, had been using the mountains as their private dumping ground for years. They had bought up vast tracts of adjacent, worthless land under a shell company. Using a new, experimental technique they called deep well infusion. They were pumping millions of gallons of toxic industrial byproduct, a sludge of solvents, heavy metals, and radioactive waste from their other operations, into the fractured granite bedrock deep beneath the ridge. They were, in effect, poisoning the entire aquifer, the lifeblood of the whole region, from the inside out. Finch had tried to sound the alarm. He wrote letters to the EPA, to the State Environmental Agency, to newspapers. His personal journal detailed the response: official denials, bureaucratic stonewalling, veiled threats. A friendly visit from the county sheriff. A break-in at his university office. He realized they weren't just going to ignore him. They were going to erase him. The last entries were filled with a desperate, paranoid urgency. He knew they were coming for him. He wrote that he had compiled all his evidence, his samples, his data, his journals, and sealed it in a custom-made, shielded container. He was going to bury it where no one would ever find it, under the floor of his cabin. His final entry was chillingly simple. They're here. I hear the truck on the access road. May God forgive them. And may someone, someday, find this. The entry was dated October 17, 1988. Anya closed the journal, her hands trembling slightly. The cabin was no longer just a rustic shelter. It was a crime scene. The ghost of Silas Kane was a corporate fabrication, a convenient folktale to keep curious locals away from a geologist's tomb. The haunting wasn't a spirit. It was a lingering poison, both literal and figurative. She looked over at the door. Ghost was now standing, alert, his ears perked, his gaze fixed not on her, but on the winding dirt track that led down the mountain. A low rumble started in his chest. Anya stood up, her body aching, her mind reeling. Dr. Finch's last entry echoed in her head. I hear the truck on the access road. She listened, and then she heard it too. The distant, unmistakable sound of an engine grinding its way up the mountain. The sound of the approaching vehicle was an intrusion, a violation of the sanctuary she had so carefully constructed. It was the grinding of gears, the crunch of tires on gravel, a mechanical beast clawing its way up the mountain toward her. Ghost stood rigid at the doorway, a low, continuous growl vibrating in his chest. He was no longer just uneasy. He was in full alert mode, the hackles on his back raised in a solid ridge. Anya moved with a sudden, sharp efficiency that banished the day's fatigue. Her mind, once clouded with the ghosts of the past, was now diamond-hard with the clarity of a present threat. She quickly and quietly returned the journals and samples to the metal container, resealed the lid, and slid it back into the crawlspace. She replaced the floorboards, arranging them to look as undisturbed as possible, and dragged the worn rug back over them. It was a hasty camouflage, but it would have to do. Every instinct, honed by years of surviving in hostile territory, told her that the arrival of this vehicle, just hours after her discovery, was not a coincidence. It was a reaction. She grabbed her pack and slung it over her shoulder. Inside was her satellite phone, a basic first aid kit, a water filter, and a small, heavy object wrapped in an oilcloth. She checked the battered pickup truck she'd driven up here. It was old but reliable. Its greatest asset was its anonymity. It was just another beat-up truck in a region full of them. The approaching engine sounded closer now, maybe a mile away. It was a heavy vehicle, a V8 engine by the sound of it, something with four-wheel drive and high clearance. Not a casual visitor. She gave Ghost a quick, sharp command. Watch. He immediately broke from his aggressive posture and melted into the shadows beside the cabin, his gray and white coat a perfect camouflage against the mottled granite boulders. He would be her eyes and ears, her perimeter alarm. Anya herself didn't hide. Instead, she grabbed the hatchet she'd been using for firewood and began to methodically split a round of oak, her movements calm and rhythmic. She presented the image of a homesteader, a woman at peace with her isolation, tough and self-sufficient. It was a mask, a form of defensive concealment she had learned long ago. Never look scared. Never look surprised. Occupy the terrain as if you belong there, and your enemy might just hesitate. The truck that emerged from the trees was a late model, crew cab pickup, glossy black and immaculately clean, a stark contrast to the mud and rust aesthetic of the local vehicles. It rolled to a stop about 30 yards from the cabin, its engine idling with a low, predatory rumble. The windows were tinted, hiding the occupants. The driver's side door opened, and a man in a crisp uniform stepped out. He was tall, thick-set, with a face that looked like it had been carved from sun-beaten leather. He wore the uniform of the Oak Haven County Sheriff's Department. A silver star was pinned to his chest. He didn't approach immediately but stood by his truck, his hand resting casually on the butt of his holstered sidearm, his eyes scanning the property. He wasn't just looking, he was assessing. He noted the patched roof, the new plexiglass window, her truck, the stack of freshly split wood. His gaze lingered on the spot where Ghost had disappeared into the shadows. Anya continued to split wood, swinging the hatchet with a steady, unhurried rhythm. Thwack! The wood split clean. She set up another round. Thwack! She did not acknowledge him. In this silent contest of wills, the first one to speak would concede the advantage. Finally, he started walking toward her, his boots crunching on the gravel. He stopped a respectful 10 feet away. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, gravelly drawl that sounded friendly but wasn't. "Sheriff Brody. Didn't expect to find anyone living up here." Anya sank the hatchet into the chopping block and turned to face him, wiping her hands on her jeans. "Just visiting," she said, her voice flat. She kept her posture relaxed but balanced, her weight on the balls of her feet. "This is private property," Brody said, gesturing vaguely at the cabin. "County records show it's derelict. I bought it." At the county auction, a flicker of something, surprise, annoyance, crossed his face before it was replaced by a folksy smile. "Well, I'll be 50 cents and a ghost story, I presume? You're a braver soul than most." He paused, his eyes doing another slow sweep of the area. "Thing is, we've had some reports. Poachers in the area. And with this old place being empty for so long, it's a natural spot for them to set up. You seen anything unusual? Heard anything?" The question was a probe, a baited hook. She knew he wasn't talking about poachers. "Just the usual," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "Deer, turkey, a black bear down by the creek. They've all been pretty respectful of the property line." His smile tightened. "That's good to hear. Still, it's a dangerous place for a woman alone. No cell service up here. Anything happens, it could be days before anyone finds you." It was a threat, wrapped in the guise of concern. "I'm not alone," Anya said quietly. As if on cue, Ghost emerged from the shadows, silent as his namesake. He didn't bark or growl. He simply stood at her side, his body radiating a calm, controlled menace. His yellow eyes were fixed on the sheriff. Brody's hand, which had been hovering near his gun, dropped to his side. He took an involuntary half-step back. He was a man used to being the most dangerous predator in any room, and he was visibly unsettled by the sudden appearance of this silent, formidable animal. "That's a fine-looking dog," he managed to say, his voice a little strained. "He's protective," Anya said. It was both a statement of fact and a warning. "Well," Brody said, recovering his composure. He tipped his hat. "Just doing my due diligence. Checking on the welfare of my citizens." He was already backing away toward his truck. "You take care now. And if you see anything unusual, you give my office a call. When you get back to town." That is, he got back into his truck, the door closing with a solid, insulated thud. He didn't leave immediately. The black truck just sat there, its engine a low thrum, watching. Anya stood her ground, her hand resting on Ghost's head, until the truck finally kicked up a cloud of dust and retreated back down the mountain. The moment it was out of sight, Anya's carefully constructed calm shattered. A tremor ran through her. The sheriff's visit was a confirmation. They knew someone was here, but did they know what she'd found? It was possible the truck was equipped with some kind of ground-penetrating sensor, and her digging had tripped an alarm. Or maybe they had someone local watching the access road. It didn't matter. They had been watching this place for 30 years. They had murdered a man to protect their secret, and then they had hidden his tomb behind a ghost story. And she had just disturbed his grave. She looked down at Ghost. He was still watching the road, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "He'll be back, boy," she whispered. "And he won't be alone." The game had changed. This was no longer about finding peace. It was about survival. Her sanctuary had become a battlefield. The sheriff's visit was the first tremor before the earthquake. It shattered Anya's fragile peace and replaced it with the cold, familiar calculus of threat assessment. She was no longer a recluse healing from old wounds. She was an operator in a compromised position, isolated and facing an enemy with unknown capabilities. Her first priority was reconnaissance. She could not fight an enemy she did not understand. She waited until the sun had set, letting the deep, impenetrable darkness of the moonless mountain night swallow the landscape. Then, with Ghost at her side, she moved out. They didn't take the road. They moved through the forest, following the ridgeline, a silent, disciplined pair. Anya wore dark clothing, her face smudged with dirt to cut the reflection from her skin. Ghost, with his storm-colored coat, was nearly invisible. It was a phantom patrol, a ghost walk through the whispering pines, eerily reminiscent of nights spent moving through the Hindu Kush. Her body remembered the rhythm, the way to place her feet to avoid snapping a twig, the way to use the shadows, the way to breathe shallow and slow. The trauma of the past was being repurposed, its sharp edges honed into tools for the present. Her destination was a high bluff that overlooked the main valley and the small town of Oakhaven, nestled in the distance like a handful of scattered embers. From here, she could see the single highway that cut through the region and, more importantly, the access roads that branched off into the deep woods. She set up a simple observation post, lying prone on a bed of pine needles, her binoculars steady in her hands. Ghost lay beside her, a living, breathing motion detector. For hours, she watched. The town went to sleep, its lights winking out one by one. The highway became a dark, empty ribbon. Then, around 2 a.m., she saw it. A convoy of 3 vehicles, turning off the main highway onto an old, unmarked logging road, a road that led into the vast, uninhabited wilderness owned by a holding company called Appalachian Resources LLC. The name rang a bell. It was one of the shell corporations Dr. Finch had mentioned in his journals. The vehicles were heavy-duty trucks, the kind used in mining or construction, followed by a dark SUV. They drove without headlights, using night vision equipment. It was a professional, clandestine operation. They were moving under the cover of darkness, confident that no one was watching. They were wrong. Anya tracked them until their infrared taillights disappeared over a distant ridge. They were heading deep into the Geo-Core property, into the heart of the poison land. She now had a direction, a vector for the threat. They weren't just using the land. They were actively operating on it. The next day, she made a difficult decision. She had to go to town. She needed supplies, but more importantly, she needed information. Leaving the cabin felt like abandoning a fortified position, but staying put was a passive strategy, and passivity got you killed. She hid Dr. Finch's container in a new location, a deep, dry crevice between 2 massive boulders 100 yards from the cabin, camouflaging the entrance with deadfall and rocks. She scribbled a few key details from the journals onto a waterproof sheet of paper. The name Geo-Core, the phrase, deep well infusion, Sheriff Brody's name, and sealed it in a plastic bag she tucked into her boot. It was a dead man's switch. If she didn't come back, at least there was a chance someone would find it. Driving into Oakhaven was like entering another country. After weeks of isolation, the noise and activity of the small town felt overwhelming. People stared at her truck, at her, at Ghost sitting sentinel in the passenger seat. She was an outsider, an unknown quantity, and in a town this small, the unknown was often synonymous with trouble. Her first stop was the small public library. The librarian, a woman with kind eyes and a cascade of gray hair, looked at her with open curiosity. Anya ignored it, heading for the public access computer. Her search for Geo-Core Mineral Extraction yielded a polished, corporate website full of pictures of pristine landscapes and talk of responsible resource management. They were a massive, multinational conglomerate with interests in mining, energy, and chemical production. Their board of directors was a who's who of political and industrial power brokers. They also had a long, documented history of environmental violations, lawsuits, and accusations of corporate malfeasance, most of which had been settled out of court for undisclosed sums. They were a dragon, and she was standing on its hoard. Her search for Appalachian Resources LLC led to a dead end. A P.O. box in Delaware. A ghost company, but a cross-reference with Geo-Core's SEC filings revealed a connection. Appalachian Resources was a wholly owned subsidiary, a tool for acquiring land quietly and without attracting attention. Sheriff Brody's name yielded more interesting results. He had been sheriff for nearly 30 years, running unopposed in the last 4 elections. His campaign finance reports showed significant donations from a handful of local businesses, all of which, with a little more digging, turned out to be owned by a single investment group with ties to Geo-Core. The sheriff wasn't just complicit, he was on the payroll. The system wasn't broken, it was a well-oiled machine designed to protect the corporation. Dr. Finch hadn't stood a chance. Anya left the library feeling the true weight of what she was up against. This wasn't a simple case of illegal dumping. It was a deeply entrenched conspiracy. Her next stop was the general store. As she was paying for batteries, canned goods, and a new, heavier-grade chain for her gate, the man behind the counter, a grizzled old-timer with a face like a topographical map, nodded toward her truck. "That your shepherd?" he asked. "Yes," Anya said, her tone guarded. "Heard Brody paid you a visit yesterday," the man said, his voice low. "Word gets around." He bagged her groceries slowly, deliberately. Some folks think that ridge is haunted. Other folks know better. They know that what's up there is poison. Been poisoning this valley for a generation. Cancers, kids born sick. We know. We just can't prove it. He looked her directly in the eye. His own were filled with a weary, decades-old anger. The last man who tried to prove it was a geologist. Disappeared 30 years ago. Brody said he just packed up and left. We knew better then, too. He pushed the bag across the counter. Tucked beside a can of beans was a small, folded piece of paper. "Jedediah Stone," the old man said. "Used to be a park ranger before he retired. Hated Geo-Core more than he hated ticks. Lives up on Miller's Creek. If you're looking for a friend, you won't find one in the sheriff's office. You might find one with Jed." Anya took the bag, her heart pounding. "Thank you," she murmured. "Don't thank me yet," the man said, turning away. "You're stirring up a hornet's nest that's been quiet for a long time. Be careful those hornets don't sting you to death." As Anya walked back to her truck, she felt a shift. She was no longer completely alone. There were others who knew, others who had suffered. They were beaten down, silenced, but they were there. The old man's warning, however, echoed in her mind. On her way out of town, a black SUV, identical to the one she'd seen in the convoy, pulled out from a side street and fell in behind her. It followed her all the way to the turnoff for her access road, maintaining a professional distance. It was a tale, and not a subtle one. It was a message. "We see you. We are watching you." When she turned onto the dirt track leading up to her cabin, the SUV continued on down the highway. They were letting her go back to her cage. As she drove up the winding, rutted road, the forest closing in around her, she realized her initial assessment had been wrong. The cabin wasn't a compromised position. It was a fortress, and the enemy had just made the mistake of letting her return to it. The tale was a declaration of intent. They were no longer probing. They were applying pressure. Anya drove the final mile to her cabin with a cold knot in her stomach, her eyes constantly scanning the dense woods that pressed in on either side of the road. The familiar landscape now seemed menacing, every shadow a potential hiding place, every rustle of leaves a possible threat. She knew they wouldn't make their move in broad daylight on the road. Their style was clandestine, rooted in denial and obfuscation. They would come at night. They would come when they thought she was vulnerable. They would come to the cabin. Back at her small clearing, she didn't unload her supplies. Instead, she began to prepare. The years she had spent trying to forget her training now became a lifeline. The muscle memory, the tactical mindset, the ingrained paranoia, it all came flooding back, not as a source of trauma, but as a wellspring of strength. Her first task was to fortify her position. The cabin, with its solid log walls, was a good defensive core. The new plexiglass window was shatter-resistant. She reinforced the heavy oak door with a crossbar fashioned from a spare floorboard and hammered long spikes into the frame. It wouldn't stop a battering ram, but it would slow them down and make a hell of a lot of noise. Noise was her ally. She spent the next few hours creating a rudimentary early warning system. Using empty cans from her supplies and lengths of tripwire from her pack, she set up a perimeter of noisemakers in the woods surrounding the cabin, placing them on the most likely avenues of approach. It was a low-tech solution, but effective. She knew the terrain better than they did. She knew where the game trails were, where the ground was softest, where a man could move without being seen. On those paths, she laid her traps. She wasn't trying to injure them, merely to announce them. Next, she turned her attention to Ghost. He was her single greatest asset. His senses were infinitely more acute than hers. She took him on a slow, deliberate walk around the perimeter, letting him scent the area, reinforcing the boundaries of the territory he was to defend. She gave him the command she had used in the field. Watch, German for watch, or guard. His posture changed instantly. He became a coiled spring of lethal potential, his focus absolute, his movements economical and silent. He understood the mission. While Ghost took up his silent vigil, Anya prepared her own tools. From the oilcloth in her pack, she unwrapped a Glock 19, her former service pistol. She field-stripped it on the porch, cleaning and oiling each component with a practiced efficiency. The familiar metallic sent a strange comfort. She had 2 spare magazines, giving her a total of 46 rounds. Not enough for a sustained firefight, but enough to make a very strong point. She loaded a magazine, chambered a round, and holstered the weapon on her hip. The weight of it was both a burden and a reassurance. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of blood orange and bruised purple, Anya made a final preparation. She took the small, waterproof bag containing the note with Geo-Core's details and tied it securely to Ghost's collar, tucking it underneath so it was hidden in his thick fur. She knelt in front of him, taking his great head in her hands. "If something happens to me," she said, her voice a low, urgent whisper, "you run. You hear me? You run. You go down the mountain. You find people. You show them this." Ghost looked at her, his intelligent eyes seeming to understand the gravity of her words. He licked her hand once, a solemn promise. She had no illusions about her chances. She was one woman, with one dog and one pistol, against a multi-billion-dollar corporation that had already made one man disappear. But Dr. Finch had been a scientist. He had fought with data and reason. Anya was a soldier. She would fight with tactics and teeth and fire. The night fell like a shroud. Anya extinguished her lantern, plunging the cabin into near-total darkness, save for the faint, dying glow of the embers in the hearth. She sat in a chair in the darkest corner of the room, away from the window, her pistol resting on the table beside her. She didn't wait in fear, but in a state of heightened awareness she hadn't felt since her last tour. Every sense was alive. She could hear the frantic chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the sigh of the wind through the pines. She could smell the cool, damp scent of the coming night. She ate a cold can of beans, forcing the food down, knowing she needed the energy. And she waited. Hours passed. The moon, a pale sliver, rose above the trees. The forest was a symphony of normal, nocturnal sounds. Nothing. She began to wonder if she had miscalculated, if her paranoia had gotten the better of her. Maybe they would wait, try to wear her down psychologically. Then, Ghost, who had been lying silently at her feet, lifted his head. His ears swiveled. A low, almost inaudible rumble started in his chest. He rose silently and moved to the door, pressing his nose to the crack at the bottom, sniffing the air. Anya's heart hammered against her ribs. She picked up the pistol, the checkered grip cool and solid in her hand. She moved to a position beside the window, staying deep in the shadows, and peered out. At first, she saw nothing but the familiar shapes of the trees, silvered by the faint moonlight. Then she saw movement. A flicker of motion at the edge of the clearing, then another. They weren't using lights. They were wearing dark clothing. She counted 3 of them, moving in a practiced, tactical formation, spreading out to approach the cabin from different angles. These were not local thugs. They were professionals. One of them, on the far side of the clearing, took a wrong step. There was a sudden, sharp clatter of metal on metal, one of her tripwire alarms. The sound was shockingly loud in the silent night. The figures froze. Ghost let out a single, deep, booming bark that echoed through the mountains like a cannon shot. It was not a sound of fear, but a declaration of war. A challenge. The siege had begun. They knew she was awake. They knew she was waiting. The pretense was over. A bright, powerful beam from a tactical flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping across the front of the cabin. A voice, amplified by a bullhorn, shattered the night. "Anya Sharma. This is Sheriff Brody. We have a warrant to search the premises. Come out with your hands up." It was a lie. There was no warrant. This was an abduction, or an execution, disguised as law enforcement. She didn't answer. She stayed low, in the dark, her weapon held in a 2-handed grip, aimed at the center of the door. The voice came again, harder this time. "Sharma, do not make this difficult. We know you're in there. We know what you found. Give us the box, and we'll let you walk away. Another lie. They would never let her walk away. She was a loose end, just like Dr. Finch had been. The first gunshot was deafening. It wasn't aimed at her. It was the sharp crack of a rifle, and it came from the woods behind the cabin. The bullet slammed into the doorframe near where Brody was standing, splintering the wood. Someone was shooting at them, and it wasn't her. The rifle shot from the darkness was a tectonic shift, instantly changing the geometry of the battle. It wasn't her round, and it wasn't from the men in the clearing. It was a third party. The effect was immediate and chaotic. The intruders, who had been focused on the cabin, were now caught in a potential crossfire. Their professional discipline fractured. "Contact rear," one of them yelled, his voice tight with alarm. They scrambled for cover behind the massive granite boulders that dotted the clearing, their flashlights cutting frantic, erratic patterns through the trees. Sheriff Brody, who had been standing exposed, dove behind his black truck. "Hold your fire," he bellowed, his voice losing its authoritative calm. "Identify yourself." The only answer was another sharp crack from the woods, and the passenger side window of Brody's truck exploded into a spiderweb of fractured glass. The shot was precise, a clear message. This was not a random hunter. This was a skilled marksman. Anya used the confusion to her advantage. While their attention was diverted, she moved from the window to the back wall of the cabin, pressing her ear against the cold logs. She needed to understand the new player in this deadly game. Was it an ally? Or just another enemy? A low voice, weathered and raspy like stones grinding together, carried on the night air from the direction of the shots. "Brody, you and your corporate thugs have no authority on this mountain. Get off my neighbor's land, or the next one goes through your engine block." Anya's breath caught in her throat. "My neighbor." The name from the general store owner flashed in her mind, Jedediah Stone. The retired ranger. It had to be him. He had been watching, waiting, an old guardian of the mountain. Brody's reply was laced with fury. "Stone, you crazy old bastard. You're obstructing a police investigation. You're going to jail for the rest of your miserable life." "What police?" Jedediah's voice shot back, dripping with contempt. "I see a crooked sheriff and 3 hired guns from a poison company. As far as I'm concerned, you're all just armed trespassers. And I have a right to defend my home and my neighbors." A tense silence fell over the clearing, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the wind in the high pines. The situation was a stalemate. Brody and his men were pinned down, unable to advance on the cabin without exposing themselves to the hidden riflemen. Jedediah was in a superior tactical position, but he was likely alone, and a direct assault on 4 armed men would be suicide. Anya knew this was her window. They were distracted, their command structure in disarray. She whispered a command to Ghost, who was vibrating with contained energy at her side. "Holen," she said. "Fetch." But she didn't send him for a ball. She gestured toward the hearth, where a small pile of fatwood kindling lay beside the embers. Ghost understood immediately. He grabbed a piece of the resin-rich wood in his mouth and brought it to her. Anya worked quickly. She used a long piece of hearth kindling to pull a glowing red ember from the dying fire. She blew on it gently, coaxing it back to a small, bright flame. She touched the flame to the end of the fatwood stick. It caught instantly, sputtering to life like a primitive torch. It was a desperate, crazy plan, born from the chaos of the moment. She moved to the side window, the one that faced the dense, dark woods away from the clearing. She smashed the plexiglass with the butt of her pistol. The sound was sharp and loud. "She's trying to get out the side," one of the men yelled. As she'd hoped, their attention snapped back to the cabin. She lit 2 more fatwood torches, then gave Ghost his second command. "Bring," she hissed, pointing out the broken window toward the darkest part of the forest. With a torch in his mouth, Ghost launched himself through the window, a gray streak carrying a brand of fire. He disappeared into the undergrowth, a moving, flickering light drawing the eye. "There she is." "To the west," one of the men shouted. 2 of them broke cover, moving to intercept the light. It was the diversion she needed. Anya lit 1 more torch, took a deep breath, and hurled it not into the woods, but onto the ground directly beneath Brody's truck. The torch landed in a patch of dry pine needles and leaves. The resin-rich forest floor ignited with a whoosh. Flames licked up at the undercarriage of the truck, catching on the greasy chassis and finding the rubber of the tires. "Fire! The truck's on fire!" Brody screamed, a new note of pure panic in his voice. The carefully planned operation had devolved into a complete fiasco. They were being shot at from one direction, flanked by a phantom in another, and now their primary vehicle was about to go up in flames. This was the moment. Anya burst out the front door, not running away from the fight, but directly into it. She stayed low, using the chaos and the flickering firelight as cover. She didn't head for the woods, but for the one place they wouldn't expect, the massive boulder where the first two men had taken cover. She came around the rock, pistol up, moving with the fluid lethality of a predator. The two men were distracted, one looking toward the fire, the other trying to locate Ghost's torch in the woods. "Drop it," she yelled, her voice the steel-hard command of a soldier who had screamed orders in the din of combat. They spun around, startled. For a split second, they saw her, a silhouette against the growing fire, pistol leveled, eyes blazing with cold fury. That second was all she needed. She didn't shoot to kill. She shot to disable. 2 rounds, fired in quick succession. One took the first man in the thigh, the other shattered the second man's shoulder. They went down, screaming in pain and surprise. Brody, seeing his men fall and his truck now fully engulfed in flames, made his choice. He abandoned the fight, scrambling into the remaining dark SUV with his one uninjured man. The vehicle roared to life, tires spinning in the dirt, and fishtailed as it sped away, retreating back down the mountain in a panicked, ignominious flight. The clearing was suddenly quiet again, the silence broken only by the crackling of the burning truck and the groans of the 2 wounded men. From the darkness, Jedediah Stone emerged. He was a tall, wiry man with a long gray beard and eyes that had seen too many winters. He held an old but well-maintained hunting rifle. He walked over to the 2 wounded men, kicked their weapons away, and looked at Anya with a mixture of awe and approval. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You are one hell of a neighbor." Ghost trotted out of the woods, the torch long since dropped, and sat at Anya's side, nudging his head against her hand. She leaned against the boulder, the adrenaline starting to recede, leaving a deep, bone-aching weariness in its wake. The battle for the cabin was over. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the core, that the war against Geo-Core had just begun. And they would be back, not with a crooked sheriff and a few hired guns, but with everything they had. The immediate aftermath of the firefight was a surreal tableau under the flickering orange glow of the burning truck. The smell of scorched metal, burning rubber, and pine filled the air. Anya's hands were shaking, a delayed reaction to the adrenaline, but her mind was icily clear. She directed Jedediah to watch the 2 wounded men while she used their own zip ties to secure their hands. They were professionals, but their arrogance had been their undoing. They had underestimated the woman, the dog, and the old man on the mountain. Jedediah, for his part, moved with the quiet competence of a man who had spent his life in the wilderness. He was all sinew and quiet resolve. He looked at Anya, then at Ghost, who was now calmly licking a wound on his paw where he'd been scraped by the broken window. "You 2 work well together," Jedediah observed. It was the highest form of praise from a man like him. "We've had practice," Anya replied, her voice still tight. They had a difficult decision to make. They couldn't just leave the wounded men here. Despite what they had tried to do, Anya's code wouldn't allow it. And they couldn't take them to the hospital in Oak Haven. Brody would have the place locked down, and their story would be twisted into a tale of an unhinged veteran attacking law enforcement. Jedediah had the solution. "There's an old logging road on the back side of this ridge," he said, pointing with his rifle. "Leads out to the next county. There's a clinic there, run by a doc who doesn't ask too many questions. We can dump these 2 there." Anonymously, it was a risk, but it was their only option. The first priority, however, was the evidence. Anya retrieved Dr. Finch's container from its hiding place. She and Jedediah spent the next hour examining the contents by the light of a lantern inside the cabin. Jedediah, who had known Dr. Finch personally, handled the journals with a reverence that bordered on holy. "Alistair was a good man," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He loved this mountain. They killed him for it. I always knew it, but I could never prove it. Now, they had the proof. Reams of it. Scientific data, personal testimony, and physical samples. It was a smoking gun, a 30-year-old case blown wide open. They had to get it out. Not just out of the cabin, but out to the world. Anya's satellite phone had a rudimentary data connection, but it was slow and unreliable, certainly not capable of transmitting the gigabytes of data scanned from Finch's journals. She needed a hardline connection and a safe one. As dawn approached, they put their plan into action. Jedediah, with his intimate knowledge of the backwoods, would lead them out. They loaded the precious container into Anya's truck. The two wounded men, now conscious and sullen, were loaded into the back of Jedediah's ancient, dented pickup. The journey was arduous. The logging road was little more than a goat track, overgrown and washed out in places. Jedediah drove with a slow, steady confidence, while Anya followed, her truck bouncing and groaning in protest. Ghost sat in her passenger seat, a silent, watchful co-pilot. They dropped the two men at the clinic as planned, leaving them with a note that simply said, "Corporate problem." Then they continued on, putting as many miles as possible between themselves and Oak Haven County. Their destination was a small city 100 miles away, a place where they could blend in, a place with a university and, hopefully, allies. Jedediah knew a professor there, a tenured environmental scientist who had been a protege of Dr. Finch and had always been suspicious of his mentor's disappearance. Dr. Eris Thorne was his name. Finding him was their best hope. They arrived in the city of Asheville late in the afternoon, two dusty, exhausted figures in beat-up trucks, looking utterly out of place amongst the tourists and students. They found Dr. Thorne's office in the university's science building. He was a man in his late 50s, with a shock of white hair and the intense, distracted air of a lifelong academic. When Jedediah introduced himself and mentioned Dr. Finch's name, Thorne's expression shifted from mild curiosity to guarded intensity. They didn't explain in the hallway. Thorne led them to a secure lab in the basement, a place shielded from electronic eavesdropping. There, on a sterile, stainless steel table, Anya and Jedediah laid out the contents of the box. For a long moment, Dr. Thorne was silent, his eyes scanning the journals, the data sheets, the sample vials. He picked up one of the journals, his hand trembling slightly. He recognized the handwriting. "Alistair," he whispered. "I knew it. I knew they did something to him." He spent the next several hours poring over the material, his initial shock giving way to a rising tide of scientific fury. "This is definitive," he said, his voice shaking with excitement and rage. "This data is impeccable. The methodology is sound. This proves, unequivocally, that Geo-Core has been committing environmental crimes on a scale that is almost unimaginable. This is bigger than anyone ever thought." He looked at Anya, his eyes sharp and assessing. "They will kill to keep this buried. They've done it before. What they did to Alistair, their attempt on you. This is their standard operating procedure," Anya nodded. "We know. That's why we're here. We have the proof, but we don't have the power to use it. They control the law, the media, everything in that region." Thorne stood up and began to pace the lab. "You're right. A direct assault is useless. We can't just hand this to the FBI. Geo-Core has lobbyists and lawyers that can tie this up in court until the sun burns out. We can't go to a major news network. They'll get an injunction and kill the story. We need to create a firestorm. Something they can't control." He stopped pacing and looked at them, a plan forming in his eyes. "We leak it. All of it. We digitize every page of these journals, every data sheet. We upload it to every environmental watchdog group, every independent journalist, every university research department on the planet. We create 1,000 copies of the truth and set them all free at once. They can't silence everyone." It was a bold, dangerous plan. It would make them targets for the rest of their lives. But it was the only way to ensure that Dr. Finch's sacrifice was not in vain. Anya looked at Jedediah, who gave a slow, determined nod. Then she looked at Ghost, who was lying patiently by the door, his head on his paws. He had started this, with a whine and a scratch at a floorboard. He had trusted her, and she had trusted him. That chain of loyalty had led them here. "Let's get to work," Anya said. The next 48 hours were a blur of scanning, uploading, and encrypting. Anya, Jedediah, and Dr. Thorne worked in shifts, fueled by coffee and a shared sense of righteous purpose. Ghost became the lab's stoic, furry mascot, a silent reminder of what had started this chain of events. Anya, Using her knowledge of secure communications, helped Thorne set up a series of dead drops and anonymous servers to disseminate the information without it being traced back to them. As the final file was being uploaded, a news alert flashed on Thorne's computer screen. A massive wildfire had broken out on Whisperwind Ridge in the mountains of Oakhaven County. The official cause was listed as a lightning strike from a dry storm. Anya knew better. They were destroying the evidence. The contaminated trees, the mutated wildlife, the poisoned earth itself. They were scorching the crime scene, erasing their sins with fire. But it was too late. The truth was already out. The ghost was out of the machine. The digital floodgates opened at precisely 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. With a final click of a mouse in Dr. Thorne's basement lab, decades of buried truth were unleashed upon the world. The files, codenamed the Finch Papers, were sent simultaneously to a carefully curated list of recipients. Investigative journalists at international newspapers, tenacious bloggers who specialized in corporate malfeasance, university environmental law departments, and grassroots activist groups from Appalachia to the Amazon. It was, as Dr. Thorne had predicted, a firestorm. The initial reaction was a wave of digital chatter, then cautious inquiries, then a cascade of confirmed facts as scientists and data analysts began to verify Finch's meticulous work. By noon, the story was leading the websites of several major news organizations. The narrative was compelling and horrifying. A martyred scientist, a 30-year corporate conspiracy, and a cover-up that involved poisoning an entire American watershed. The name Geo-Core, once just another corporate entity, became synonymous with environmental villainy. Their stock price began to plummet. Anya, Jedediah, and Thorne monitored the fallout from the relative safety of the lab, watching a battle they had started now being fought on a global scale. Geo-Core's public relations department issued a furious denial, calling the documents a malicious fabrication and a smear campaign by anti-business extremists. They threatened lawsuits against anyone who published the material. Sheriff Brody held a press conference, his face a mask of false sincerity, claiming this so-called evidence was stolen by a disturbed veteran with a history of violence who had assaulted his officers while they were investigating a poaching ring. But their lies were no match for the sheer volume of evidence. Dr. Finch's detailed, dated journals were a powerful testament. His water samples, retested by Thorne's lab, confirmed the catastrophic levels of contamination. Other universities began running their own tests on the Oakhaven aquifer, and their results mirrored Finch's. The fire on Whisperwind Ridge, initially reported as a natural event, was now being viewed with deep suspicion. Arson investigators, spurred by anonymous tips, were dispatched by the state, bypassing Brody's jurisdiction. The narrative Geo-Core and Brody tried to control was crumbling. Anya felt a profound sense of vindication, but not of peace. She knew that the corporation, wounded and cornered, would be at its most dangerous. They would not be focused on the data anymore, but on the source of the leak. On her. "You can't go back," Thorne said, his face grim. "Not to the cabin. Not ever. They'll be watching it, waiting. You and Jedediah are ghosts now. You have to disappear." He was right. The life Anya had tried to build on that mountain was gone, burned away just like the forest. But something else had been forged in its place. She looked at Jedediah, the old ranger who had become her staunchest ally. He met her gaze and nodded. "The mountain will heal," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "But this sickness, this corporate poison, it has to be cut out for good. Our work isn't done." The Finch papers had exposed the crime, but the fight for justice was just beginning. Federal agencies, now under immense public pressure, were forced to open investigations. Congressional hearings were convened. Lawsuits were filed on behalf of the people of Oakhaven, people who finally had an explanation for the mysterious illnesses that had plagued their community for a generation. Anya, Jedediah, and Dr. Thorne became a small, mobile command center for the burgeoning movement. They moved from city to city, staying in cheap motels, using burner phones and encrypted laptops. They fed information to journalists, connected victims with lawyers, and used Finch's detailed geological maps to direct investigators to Geo-Core's hidden dumping sites. Anya's military training was invaluable. She taught them operational security, how to detect surveillance, how to move without being seen. She was no longer running from her past, but using it to build a future. Ghost was their constant companion, their silent partner. His presence was a calming influence in the chaotic, paranoid world they now inhabited. He was a living link back to the quiet cabin, to the moment this all began. He would often rest his head on Anya's lap while she worked late into the night, his steady breathing a reminder of the simple, profound loyalty that had set everything in motion. One evening, months later, they were huddled around a laptop in a motel room in Virginia when a news alert came in. The CEO of Geo-Core had resigned. Sheriff Brody had been indicted by a federal grand jury on charges of corruption, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. The corporation, facing hundreds of lawsuits and a full-blown federal racketeering investigation, had agreed to a settlement. It was one of the largest environmental penalties in history. They would be forced to fund the cleanup of the Oak Haven watershed, a project that would take decades and cost billions. It wasn't a total victory. No amount of money could bring back Dr. Finch or undo the years of suffering, but it was a reckoning. Justice, long delayed, had finally arrived. Anya closed the laptop. The room was quiet. Jedediah stared out the window, a single tear tracing a path through the wrinkles on his cheek. "We did it, Alistair," he whispered. "We did it." Anya felt a strange sense of release, a quiet she hadn't felt since before the wars, before the bombs, before the ghosts. The mission was over. She knelt and wrapped her arms around Ghost, burying her face in his thick fur. He had found the poison under the floorboards, and in doing so, he had helped her find the poison in her own soul and purge it. He had led her not to the peace of isolation she thought she wanted, but to the more meaningful peace of purpose. She had bought a haunted cabin for 50 cents. The legend said a ghost guarded a treasure. The legend was true. The ghost was a scientist named Alistair Finch, and the treasure he guarded was the truth. It was a truth that had cost him his life, but had saved a mountain, a community, and in the end, a soldier and her dog. For those who have followed this unexpected journey, know that the path to healing is rarely the one we plan. Sometimes it's a winding, dangerous road up a mountain we never intended to climb. But if you have a loyal companion at your side, you never have to walk it alone.